The profound, bone-deep thrum of the containment field vanished, leaving Nolan Price standing in a void of silence that felt thicker than the vacuum outside. His teeth stopped buzzing instantly. He had executed the frequency stabilization, overriding the scheduled sonic spike, a calculated breach of Protocol Row 9. It was a stupid, small kindness toward a cosmic terror, purchased at the potential cost of his 1,200 credits for the shift, perhaps his freedom. Taris, the Mandate Overseer, a voice that lived exclusively in spreadsheets and cold steel, crackled back to life. Price, shift complete, metrics nominal, you are cleared. Nolan took a breath, the recycled air of Nomara Deep scraping against the back of his throat, carrying the faint scent of ozone and aging hydraulic fluid. Affirmative, Overseer. Nominal. He did not wait for Taris to disconnect, cutting the comms feed himself. Obedience was a temporary necessity. Respect was a luxury he reserved for the dead or the truly desperate. He checked the main console. The log entry for the override was shielded. Hidden beneath 6 layers of priority maintenance codes, only a mechanic or someone who had been burned by the system would know to look for. Nolan had once been one of the Mandate's elite jump drive engineers until a core meltdown on the Acheron 7. A failure he reported, but was forced to take the fall for, reduced him to guarding sleeping alien queens for minimum security pay. The system demanded compliance, even when compliance meant catastrophic failure. His demotion was a permanent scar, the injustice a cold weight under his ribs. He turned toward the center of the chamber. Brythar. She was the matriarch, the last known survivor of the species that had scarred 3 human systems. The official designation, Asset, felt insufficient, almost comical. She was enormous, curled into a silent, imposing spiral within the blue light of the energy field. Her chitin, usually dull and obsidian, now reflected the pale light with a hidden luster. Nolan stepped closer to the field perimeter, ignoring the safety warnings flashing in the upper corner. He noticed the texture. It wasn't smooth. The scale plates were ridged, worn down by galactic ages and conflict, looking less like biological armor and more like sediment layers on an ancient, cold moon. He saw a tiny, precise imperfection near what he assumed was her shoulder joint, a sliver of plate that looked patched, held by a shimmering organic resin. She was terrifying, but she was also fragile, a prisoner held by the cheapest, most efficient form of torment, the constant, suppressive hum. The air temperature in the chamber was near freezing, calibrated to slow her metabolism to a crawl. Nolan pulled his collar tighter, feeling the persistent cold dread leach the residual heat from his hands. He had risked everything for a creature that could end him with a single, massive twitch, merely because he hated the sound of regulated suffering. As he walked toward the exit lock, Nolan noticed the tertiary diagnostics panel he had rigged himself, a small, unauthorized screen intended to track long-term energy decay rates in the field. He paused. The metrics were wildly off. It wasn't the frequency spike that caused the deviation. It was the suppression. He leaned over the cold aluminum casing. The system wasn't compensating for Brythar's distress by increasing the sonic pressure, as Taris believed. The system was trying to replicate it. The Mandate didn't want the Queen merely sedated. They wanted her in a state of carefully managed pain, a biological weapon kept on the verge of breakdown. Nolan felt the acid rise in his stomach. His small act of compassion had been a technical failure, perhaps even an inadvertent aid to her captors. He was about to seal the log and exit when the tertiary screen, flashing a coded sequence of biofeedback metrics, suddenly changed. It wasn't standard Mandate code. It was alien, complex, and incredibly dense. It was a data packet dump, a compressed burst of information that had piggybacked on the momentary stabilization of the containment field. Brythar had initiated the transfer. Nolan gripped the console, his knuckles white against the metal. The chamber was silent. The Queen was still immobile, profoundly asleep, or pretending to be. But now, Nolan held something she had intentionally given him. The volume of data was enormous, too complex for a standard encryption key. It was genetic, linguistic, and geometric data all mixed together, flashing in rapid, incomprehensible pulses across the small screen. He realized the severity of his error. He hadn't just made her comfortable, he had opened a channel. He looked back at Brythar. Even in deep slumber, the matriarch seemed to possess a terrible, focused awareness. Her posture, the way her colossal limbs were placed. It wasn't just sleep. It was a siege stance. Click. The lock to the main chamber cycled open. Nolan froze. The replacement team was 20 minutes early. He had maybe 3 seconds to make the data disappear. He couldn't just delete it. The system might log the attempted wipe. He needed to get it out. His maintenance multi-tool was strapped to his thigh. He ripped the small tertiary drive port from the console, barely larger than his thumb, and jammed it into his tunic pocket. It was a crude, desperate move, leaving a gaping, smoking hole in the dashboard. The door hissed fully open, revealing 2 figures in standard Mandate security armor. They were bulkier than the usual guards, their pulse rifles held at a low ready. One, shorter but clearly the team lead, stepped into the cold light. Nolan recognized the insignia. Internal investigation. They weren't here for routine turnover. "Price," the lead guard stated, his voice flat, processed through the helmet's vocoder. "You are relieved of duty. Step away from the console." Nolan took a slow step back, his hands held open, displaying the wear and tear of 1,000 forgotten repairs. He tasted stale air and metallic apprehension. "Problem, Corporal. Shift log is clean. Containment is stable." "Not the containment, Price," the guard countered, stepping closer, his heavy synthetic boots scraping the icy floor. "The problem is the anomaly in the tertiary power signature 6 hours ago, and the sudden unscheduled hardware failure on your station." Nolan felt a knot tighten in his solar plexus. They had seen the override, not the code itself, but the energy signature drop, and they were already here. "Routine system decay," Nolan lied easily, forcing his voice to remain level. "I logged the spike and had to bypass the auto-adjust sequence. Saved them a 24-hour shutdown, actually. Ask Taris." The corporal ignored him, stepping past him to inspect the damaged console. The second guard, tall and silent, positioned himself between Nolan and the exit lock. Nolan felt the alien data drive pressing against his chest, a burning, secret weight. If they searched him, he was finished. The Mandate executed traitors quietly, efficiently, and then erased their names from the payroll. As the corporal started scanning the console with a handheld reader, a low, barely perceptible sound began to emanate from Brythar. It was not the sonic thrum of containment, but a biological sound, a deep, clicking vibration that resonated only in the human inner ear. A pressure sensation, not truly sound. The corporal suddenly staggered, clapping a hand to his helmet. "Get the inhibitors on maximum. She's stirring." Nolan knew better. Brythar wasn't stirring. She was communicating. And she was using the sudden silence he provided to send a pulse that was purely biological. The clicking intensified, forcing the air out of Nolan's lungs. It was agonizingly directed, a sheer wave of mental force that bypassed standard electronic dampeners. The corporal stumbled back, dropping his reader. As he hit the floor, Nolan felt a final, intense surge from the sleeping Queen. Not a message, a lock. Nolan realized the alien data was now locked to his own physiological signature, encrypted by a biological key that was currently scrambling the brains of the 2 security guards. He was the only one in the room who could access it, because he had been the one to ease her pain. Complicity, he thought, staring at the sheer immensity of the matriarch, had just become survival. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the discarded rifle across the floor and sprinted toward the door, shoving past the stunned, tall guard. The exit lock sealed behind him with a final, echoing crash of steel. He was running, the heat of the stolen data burning through his tunic. He had gone from a quiet watchman to an accomplice in a galactic security breach, all because of one moment of petty defiance. He didn't know what the data meant or why Brythar had chosen him, but he knew one thing. He could not go back, and the Mandate now owned his death warrant. He had guarded a queen for one night, and now he carried her secret. The steel crash of the lock behind Nolan Price was not a sound of escape, but the hammer stroke of an irrevocable verdict. He didn't run toward the main arteries of Nomara Deep, where security sweeps would concentrate. Instead, he plunged down into the service channels, the tight, shadowed spaces where 3 decades of engineering grime settled like ash. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The sterile, ionized air of the containment level gave way to something thick and oily, chilled by proximity to the hull plating. Every step on the grating echoed his hurry, but the noise was swallowed by the station's constant, low-frequency shudder, the mechanical breathing of the deep space fortress. He felt the stolen drive, barely the size of his thumb, heat rapidly through the thin fabric of his tunic. It felt less like a storage device and more like a contained, humming insect, struggling to break free. He found his refuge 5 decks down, in a defunct pressure lock leading to the old, decommissioned cargo bay, Bay 47. It was dark, smelling powerfully of stale hydraulic fluid and something organic, like damp, forgotten cloth. The cold here was structural, bone deep, radiating directly from the exposed hull plates. Nolan slumped against a stack of rusted environmental control boxes, pulling his knees up tight against the cold. The immediate surge of adrenaline had passed, replaced by a deep, hollow fatigue that made his muscles twitch uncontrollably. He peeled the drive from his chest. The casing was warm, almost feverish, confirming the immense processing power concentrated inside. He opened his maintenance kit, pulling out a specialized reader, a tool designed for interfacing with damaged, non-standard Mandate technology, something he'd kept since his elite days. He slotted the alien drive into the reader port. The screen remained blank. Nolan felt a spike of frustration so sharp, it was almost physical pain. He ran a sequence of brute-force decryption algorithms, starting with the simplest, cycling through 1,000 known alien encryptions the Mandate had catalogued over the centuries. The reader flashed green, then immediately redlined, locking down. The drive was not encrypted with code. It was locked by complexity. The volume of data was too dense to parse, collapsing Nolan's standard decryption matrix before it could even begin the process. Brythar hadn't just secured the data, she had weaponized it against interpretation. Nolan rested his forehead against the cold metal casing of the reader. He focused on the memory of the matriarch's eyes. Even in deep sleep, they had radiated a cold, focused intelligence. She didn't hand him a simple message. She gave him the key to a door he couldn't see, knowing he didn't have the tools to turn it. He tried a different approach. Physiological signature verification. He placed his thumb on the drive's sensor pad, feeding his own biometrics back into the system. The complex, foreign sequence of pulses that had scrambled the guard's brains earlier was the key. The reader flared to life. The data didn't decrypt into readable text. Instead, it rendered as a 3-dimensional geometric structure, a constellation of lines, angles, and impossibly complex nodes. It looked like an architectural schematic for an 8-dimensional universe, or perhaps the complete genetic mapping of a dying star. There was no translation, no key, only pure, massive information. This is not for technicians, Nolan realized with crushing certainty. This is for a linguist, or a god. He looked at the shifting geometric shape, hypnotized by its sheer alien brilliance. Then, a low, coded alert tone chirped 3 times from the defunct comms unit high above the maintenance bay. It wasn't a general alarm. It was a mandate priority signal, typically reserved for high-value targets. Code 9 Delta Zero. Unauthorized transfer of Class A biological intelligence data. Nolan knew that code. It meant they weren't searching for a disgruntled mechanic who damaged a console. They were searching for a saboteur and a traitor. The system wasn't reacting with panic. It was reacting with cold mechanical efficiency. Taris wasn't leading this search. It was the Mandate's internal security corps, the people who cleaned up the mess on Acheron 7th and made Nolan the scapegoat. He felt the familiar coldness settle over his old scar, a thin, white line running just below his left earlobe, a souvenir from the Acheron 7 meltdown, where he'd stayed behind to seal the core, only to be accused of negligent failure while the admirals received commendations. The system had crushed him once, taking his career and his dignity. It demanded that he follow the protocol, even if the protocol was fundamentally broken. His crime now, he knew, was far less about stealing the data than about proving the Mandate's methods of control were vulnerable. He had to get off Nomara Deep, and he had to find someone who could read geometric language dense enough to shatter a standard processor. He disconnected the drive, the heat receding slightly as the screen went dark. He needed a conduit, a whisper channel out of this sector, and a translator for a language that defied physics. He ran a cross-reference search through his old engineering contacts, the underground net that serviced decommissioned orbital stations and black market drive parts. He filtered the search for 3 criteria: non-mandate affiliated, xenolinguist specialization, and a history of successful high-risk data extraction. One name glowed faintly on the restricted list, highlighted in an old, unstable cipher. Elsha Pike. Elsha Pike. Rumors said she was the finest linguist the Fringe had ever produced, specializing in the pre-contact dialects of species long extinct, making her the perfect counter-engineer to Bryther's ancient, complex message. She operated out of the deepest, most unregulated sectors, trading alien artifacts and encrypted knowledge for credits and complete anonymity. She was the Mandate's ghost. Nolan accessed the local station schematics. The Mandate employed a dozen different layers of digital surveillance, but the physical escape routes remained surprisingly predictable. He knew a maintenance tunnel leading to the main freight docking bay, Bay 1, currently under automated lockdown due to a fuel spill. He pulled the cold, stale air deep into his lungs. The decision was no longer about his 1,200 credits, or even his life. It was about deciphering the immense burden of injustice Bryther had placed on him. He secured the drive and his tools. Before leaving the cold bay, he initiated a coded burst transmission on an unstable frequency, knowing it would only last 3 seconds before Mandate countermeasures targeted it. To Elsha Pike. Subject, Gahara Matriarch. Payment, complete transfer of the asset data minus a single copy for decryption. He hit the send key. The transmission screamed into the void, a brief, desperate signal across parsecs of silence. Almost instantly, his reader chirped back. It wasn't a reply, but a navigational vector. A set of temporal and spatial coordinates that pointed not toward a known space station or a habitable planet, but toward an unmapped region of the outer veil, a gravitational shadow zone where Mandate laws dissolved into starlight and rumor. She had responded, and she expected him to come. The signal included one final untranslated geometric sequence, simpler than Bryther's initial dump, but clearly related. Nolan squinted at the shape, memorizing its sharp angles and internal pressures. It was a lock, yes, but also an invitation. He stood up, shaking the cold from his legs, the metallic smell of the old bay replaced by the bitter scent of ozone from the rapidly expanding hole in his career. He was a mechanic running from the law, chasing a woman he had never met, guided by a message from a sleeping queen he barely understood. Complicity had become a vector. Nolan Price turned and ran toward the freight bay, knowing that in the outer veil, dignity might cost him everything, but bureaucracy could no longer take it from him. The moment Nolan Price slammed his hand onto the emergency door override in the maintenance tunnel leading to Bay 1, the station reacted with cold, calculated violence. He expected the lock to cycle slowly, grinding against 3 days of disuse. Instead, a screech of tearing metal erupted, and the tunnel lights died simultaneously, plunging the narrow corridor into absolute darkness. He didn't need his eyes to know the mandate had isolated the sector. The air suddenly turned viscous, thickening with the sharp, acrid smell of ozone and superheated circuits. The temperature spiked, climbing 20 degrees in 5 seconds as the localized environmentals failed, forcing the sweat already coating his skin to instantly evaporate, leaving a chilled, clammy residue. Nolan activated the micro-torch on his glove. The weak beam cut through the greasy blackness, revealing the damage. The electromagnetic plate meant to release the door had fused itself shut, twisted into a grotesque, blackened knot. This wasn't a standard lockdown. It was a targeted, physical destruction of his escape route. They knew the schematics as well as I do, he thought, pulling his tools. They anticipated the maintenance bypass. He needed power, massive and instant, to shear the fused metal. His multi-tool, usually capable of cracking anything up to reinforced titanium, whined weakly. He had to improvise. The tunnel ran alongside a primary plasma conduit, a thick insulated pipe meant to feed auxiliary power to the orbital tethers. Unauthorized tapping into that line was a Class 1 felony, risking catastrophic system failure for half the station. But the door was sealed, and the air was getting thin. He peeled back a section of the conduit's insulation, the heavy polymer smoking slightly under the heat lamp. Beneath it, the pipe pulsed faintly with the contained energy. Using a specialized kinetic shunt, a tool designed for controlled energy bleeds, Nolan set about rigging a quick charge. The work was precise, demanding total focus. The air conditioning was dead, and the ambient heat from the plasma line made the tunnel feel like a foundry. Sweat ran into his eyes, tasting metallic and sharp. The silence was unnatural. Nomara Deep was never truly quiet. There was always the deep space shudder, the mechanical whisper of life support. Now, that hum was gone, replaced by the relentless crackle of static building in the walls. The station wasn't breathing, it was holding its breath. He finished the shunt connection, securing the clamps. He needed 30 seconds to flood the door lock with enough juice to vaporize the seal. He keyed the charging sequence. 10 seconds. The magnetic field around the plasma line intensified, making the fine hairs on Nolan's arms stand on end. 20 seconds. The scent of scorched polymer was overpowering. The kinetic shunt glowed cherry red. He gripped the metal casing tightly, feeling the raw building power trying to rip through his gloves. 28 seconds. A sudden, sharp vibration hit the deck plates from above. Not a systemic shudder, but heavy, focused steps. They were moving fast, and they were close. 2, possibly 3 men in heavy armor. Code 9 Delta Zero. They weren't taking prisoners. Nolan reached 30 seconds. He ripped the shunt off the main plasma line, feeling a massive spike of feedback jolt up his arm. Pain shot from his shoulder to his wrist. He ignored the fire, throwing the still-smoking shunt against the fused lock plate. Ka-thum. The explosive discharge was blinding. Metal vaporized. The door assembly twisted violently inward, throwing a shower of superheated shrapnel and sparking copper wires toward him. Nolan threw his arm up over his face, feeling several tiny, agonizing impacts against his exposed forearm. He tasted char and copper. The tunnel was open to Bay 1, but the exit was a ruin, a smoking, jagged hole. He scrambled through the gap, his shoulder protesting violently. He landed hard on the slick ferrocrete floor of Bay 1. The vast cargo area was even colder than the tunnels, a refrigerated space designed to hold deep-frozen atmospheric samples. The cold was a relief, washing over the burning heat of the tunnel air. He immediately noticed the problem. The coordinates Elsha Pike had sent him pointed to a specific freight vessel, a decommissioned patrol runner called the Apiron. It was supposed to be docked at Bay 1, tucked away in the shadows of the much larger, active transports. It wasn't. Bay 1 was nearly empty, save for 3 looming automated stacking units, silent and still. The Apiron was gone. Nolan checked his reader. The connection to the Pike data drive was stable, but the internal sensor array was showing a rapid corruption rate. The sheer complexity of Brythar's data, coupled with the power surge from the shunt, was frying the reader's logic board. He had maybe 5 minutes before the entire drive, containing the key to his freedom and the Queen's secret, collapsed into irreversible static. He felt the cold, hard press of fear. He had risked his freedom for a drive he couldn't read, chasing a pilot who wasn't there. Then, the static crackling that had been building in the walls of the maintenance tunnel burst into full, roaring life. The lights above him, emergency fluorescents running on backup power, flickered violently, casting long, jumping shadows. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of energy weapons discharging echoed down the tunnel. The pursuit team had reached the fused lock. They weren't using low-impact, stunning rounds. They were using pulse rifles, set to lethal. Nolan pressed himself against the nearest automated stacker, a massive steel behemoth meant to move 80 tons of cargo. He needed an exit, and he needed a distraction. He glanced at the terminal for Bay 1's environmentals. Lockdown was still active, courtesy of the mandate. But the fuel spill, the official reason for the lockdown, was still listed as unmitigated. A reckless idea formed, desperate and immediate. The emergency fuel supply was stored in pressurized, volatile tanks beneath the floor. If he could overload the vapor regulators in the tanks, he could create a localized, non-catastrophic pressure rupture, a plume of hyper-cold, expansive vapor that would temporarily blind the security teams and flood the exit tunnel. He sprinted toward the control panel, his injured arm throbbing rhythmically. He reached the console and began to work, his fingers flying over the bypass codes. The mandate system was robust, but Nolan had designed parts of its older iteration. He was inside the fuel pressure controls in 2 seconds. As he initiated the overload sequence, he heard them emerge from the tunnel. "Clear the area. Target sighted near the auxiliary controls." A voice boomed, distorted by a helmet vocoder. Nolan didn't look up. He felt the drive in his pocket heat to an unbearable temperature. The reader in his other hand was spitting sparks. He knew he was running out of time. The dilemma. The overload sequence required a manual stabilizer to prevent the pressure surge from becoming a full explosion, destroying the data drive by shockwave. The stabilizer was a small, crucial component currently inside his damaged reader. If he used it to stabilize the fuel surge, the reader and the data inside it would gain perhaps 60 seconds of life. But the stabilization sequence required him to manually hold the component in place for 5 seconds, exposing his injured arm to a high thermal discharge. If he saved the arm, the data fried. If he saved the data, the discharge might permanently damage his tendons. A pulse bolt slammed into the wall a foot to his right, showering him with concrete dust and ringing his ears. He was out of time for calculus. Nolan ripped the stabilizer component, a quarter-sized crystalline chip, from the reader, ignoring the catastrophic shutdown warning flashing across the screen. He slammed it into the fuel console's override slot, holding it steady with his throbbing, burned forearm. A surge of blue electrical energy erupted from the component, stabilizing the regulator. Nolan gritted his teeth, the smell of burnt flesh rising instantly. He held it for 1 second. 2. 3. His vision swam, the pain a white, hot spike. 4. 5. He ripped his arm back, leaving the component glowing white-hot in the console. He glanced down. A long, weeping blister was already forming along the length of his forearm. The pain was immediate, sharp, and debilitating, but the surge was controlled. Whoosh! A massive cloud of dense, white, hyper-chilled fuel vapor erupted from the floor vents, filling Bay 1 in seconds. Visibility dropped to 0. The security guards immediately stopped firing, choking and sputtering against the sub-zero cloud. Nolan turned, sprinting blindly toward the far end of the bay, where the smaller freight lock, Bay 1A, was located. He ran relying purely on muscle memory and the geometric map of the station etched into his mind from years of repair work. The white cloud began to dissipate, thinning rapidly as the bay's remaining functional circulation units kicked in. As Nolan reached the emergency lock of Bay 1A, he felt a crushing exhaustion. He leaned heavily against the cool metal, gasping for the thinning air. He pulled out the data drive and the now dead reader. The drive felt cool, stabilized. He had bought himself time. He looked at the small 3x3 window of the lock door. Through the thick, armored glass, he could see the distant cold stars and the curve of a distant planet. Freedom was 200 feet away. Then, a sudden, heavy shadow crossed the starlight. Docked against the outside hull, completely shielded from the internal Bay 1 surveillance, was a massive, non-mandate transport vessel. It was enormous, dark, and utterly silent. It was not the small, agile Apiron he was looking for. This ship was colossal, brutalist in design, and painted in the deep, unreflective obsidian of a military vessel. The ship's landing ramp hissed down, lowering slowly onto the outer lock seal. And standing silhouetted against the dim starlight, a figure emerged. Not the security team, who were now struggling through the dissipating fog of Bay 1, but a lone individual. Tall, unnervingly still, wearing heavy, dark gear. The helmet visor reflected the cold starlight back as a single, piercing green line. As the figure moved, the light caught the shoulder insignia. A stylized, metallic raven head. Nolan's blood turned to ice. That wasn't mandate security. That was the symbol of the Carthage Fleet, the private security force owned by the Council Lords. The real power behind the mandate. The very people who had set him up on the Acheron 7. They weren't here to retrieve stolen data. They were here for him, specifically. They had anticipated his escape route, anticipated his target, and were waiting for him at the final door. As the figure raised a heavy, silenced rifle, another shadow detached itself from the ship's ramp. A second figure, smaller, but moving with predatory grace. Nolan was pinned. Bay 1 was locked, the internal mandate team was closing fast behind him, and the private army of the Council Lords was blocking his only exit to the void. He pressed his back against the cold lock, the raw data pressed against his bruised chest, his burned arm useless. He had run out of time and options. The cold pressed against Nolan's spine, a deep, immediate contrast to the boiling heat of his arm. The pain was a persistent, white-hot line running from his elbow to his knuckles, making the hand useless. He leaned against the icy steel of the lock, pinned between the fading steam and the silent, imposing figures of the Carthage fleet guards. He looked at the metallic raven head insignia catching the starlight on the lead operative's shoulder plate. The Council Lords. The same bastards who had engineered the core breach on the Acheron 7 and paid Nolan silence with his career. They weren't here for justice. They were here for control. The smaller, second operative moved, raising a heavy-caliber projectile rifle, not a pulse weapon, meaning they wanted quiet, clean kills. Nolan had perhaps 3 seconds before they bypassed the lock's safety and vaporized him. He couldn't run, he couldn't fight, and his communications were jammed by their proximity. All he had left was the data drive, the secret placed upon him by the sleeping matriarch, the burden of a cosmic injustice. He forced his trembling left hand into his tunic pocket, pulling out the small drive. The dedicated reader was useless, but his engineering tunic featured an auxiliary diagnostic port near the collar. A relic from his high-level days, meant for rapid systems checks. He ripped the port cover open, ignoring the tiny burst of static electricity, and slammed the alien drive into the socket. The drive immediately bypassed the tunic's internal OS, projecting the alien geometric data directly onto the small heads-up display embedded in Nolan's visor. The data wasn't text. It was pure, shimmering structure, an architectural map of something vast and terrible. Nolan didn't see lines and numbers. He saw energy flow, mapped onto the Nomara Deep Station schematics. He gasped, the stale air catching in his throat. What he thought was a containment field was a siphon. Nomara Deep was not holding Brytha prisoner, it was actively harvesting her. The sonic torture wasn't designed merely to keep her sedated, it was maximizing her biological output through controlled stress. The matriarch, the last of her line, was a living, processing energy plant. The Mandate wasn't worried about her waking up and escaping. They were worried about her metabolic rate dropping too low, and the harvested energy wasn't powering the station. The geometric overlay showed the massive output being concentrated and redirected, not to the Mandate fleet arrays, but into the deep space jump drive engine, buried 30 decks below the main habitation ring, an engine designed not for travel, but for massive localized disruption. The data confirmed the horror. The Council Lords were using Brythar's sustained, contained suffering to charge a weapon capable of generating a sector-wide jump drive collapse, tearing space into unstable, unregulated fragments. The chaos would be blamed on a resurgence of Gahara activity, paving the way for the Carthage fleet to swoop in under the guise of stabilizing the territory, seizing control of vital resource nodes. It was the Acheron 7 all over again, but scaled up to planetary genocide. Nolan felt a crushing wave of nausea. He had eased her pain for a fleeting moment, and in return, she had gifted him the knowledge of his own impending oblivion. His petty act of disobedience had led him to a truth that could end billions. The choice was immediate and impossible. The Carthage operatives were 2 feet away from breaching the lock. Nolan could surrender the drive to them now. They would likely take him prisoner, extract the data, stabilize their weapon, and keep him alive as a technical asset. He would live, but the Council Lords would succeed. Or he could execute the only countermeasure the Matriarch's data suggested: a localized, maximal frequency broadcast of the structural code itself, an action that would force the Mandate system to recognize the massive, unauthorized energy drain. The resulting overload would likely fry the jump drive weapon immediately, but it would also instantly cut all power to the containment field. If he broadcast the code, he saved the sector from chaos. But he released Brythar, and a creature capable of sterilizing 3 human colonies 80 years ago, freshly roused from a state of torture, would be loose on Nomara Deep. He would doom himself, the entire station crew, and potentially the Mandate team closing in behind him. He looked at the icy gleam of the security helmet outside the window. He tasted the burnt copper and the cold, thin air. He thought of the deep, weary resignation in Brythar's massive curled posture. The injustice of her eternal torment felt heavier than the potential cost of her freedom. You already risked your life to stop the buzzing, he thought. Finish the job. Nolan pressed his left thumb onto the auxiliary beacon access pad located beside the lock. The pad was designed for short-range emergency distress bursts, not complex data transmission. He had less than 2 seconds to transmit the massive geometric code before the system recognized the attempt as a malicious injection and fried the drive permanently. He accessed the specialized Pike frequency, the subtle, whispered channel Elsha Pike had used to send her coordinates. He keyed the final sequence. Inject geometric code, maximal output. Broadcast via Pike frequency. The pain in his right arm flared in response to the massive energy surge passing through his body. The air around him suddenly felt heavy, thick with electrical energy. Beziezed. The emergency beacon, a flimsy, quarter-sized dish on the exterior hull, did not flash. It screamed. A wave of pure, geometric energy, impossibly dense and loud, ripped through the station's internal structure and into the void. The immediate feedback was violent. The lights in Bay 1A, which had been struggling on backup power, exploded. The small chamber was plunged into pitch darkness, save for the momentary flash of red sparks cascading from the ceiling panels. Outside, the first Carthage operative fired. The projectile slammed into the steel door, inches from Nolan's head, the sound muffled but immense. Nolan ripped the drive from the dying port, clutching it tightly. The data had been sent. Then, the true consequence arrived. The deep space shudder of Nomara Deep, the constant mechanical pulse of its life support, ceased entirely. A complete, terrifying silence descended, more profound than the death of sound. The station was powered down. All systems dead. And 15 decks above, in the cold, silent chamber where she had endured her mandated slumber, the containment field went dark. The deep, resonant thrum that had kept her suppressed for decades vanished utterly. Nolan heard a new sound then, penetrating the reinforced steel of Bay 1, vibrating up through the soles of his boots. It was not a roar or a sonic blast. It was a single, long, biological sound, like the grinding of tectonic plates, the massive, slow exhale of an entity that had held its breath for 80 years. Brethar was awake. Outside the emergency lock, the 2 Carthage operatives, realizing the catastrophic scale of the power failure, stopped firing. The one with the Raven insignia pressed a gloved hand to his helmet, his voice a tight, frantic whisper that filtered clearly through the silent hull. Mandate power grid is 0. We have loss of comms. Repeat, containment failure imminent. Get the extraction charge ready. Now. The second operative, the smaller one, moved with terrifying speed. Instead of trying to breach the door, she slammed a heavy explosive device directly onto the seal, keyed the timer for 2 seconds, and sprinted back up the lowered ramp. Nolan realized their goal had shifted. They weren't trying to capture him anymore. They were trying to seal the station shut and escape before the matriarch reached them. He shoved himself away from the door, scrambling across the slick floor as the timer light on the bomb flashed red. 1 second. The last thing Nolan saw before the explosion was the massive, obsidian hull of the Carthage transport rising rapidly, accelerating away from the station with a velocity that defied physics. They weren't abandoning him. They were abandoning the entire station. The Council Lords had gotten their data, and now they were cutting the cord, ensuring maximum chaos. Boom! The explosive charge tore through the emergency lock door and the outer hull in a violent, controlled detonation. Instead of venting into vacuum, the explosion ripped through the airlock seals and plunged Nolan into a torrent of pressurized, hyper-cold vapor and tearing metal. He felt the cold shock hit him, sending a spike of agony through his burned arm. He was thrown backward, the rush of air slamming him into the steel stacker unit. His vision went white. When the world stabilized again, Nolan was on the floor, coughing violently against the cold fumes, tasting blood and ionized metal. The locked door to Bay 1A was gone, replaced by a gaping, jagged hole leading directly to the vacuum of space, shielded only by the remaining, slowly dissipating fuel vapor. But the cold was immediately replaced by a sudden, intense heat, emanating from the main corridor of Bay 1. The heat was chemical, fast, and growing. The Mandate security team, trapped by the total power failure and the newly vented airlock, had initiated a desperate countermeasure. They were flooding the area with high-level incendiary gel, designed to seal the area and burn away any trace evidence, including Nolan. Nolan pushed himself up, his burned arm throbbing mercilessly. He looked out the shattered exit. The blackness of space beckoned, but his immediate surroundings were filling with a thick, viscous goo that smelled like plastic and death. He had exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had locked himself inside a burning station with an enraged matriarch rising from 8 decades of suppressed agony. He felt the drive in his pocket, now cool, silent, and entirely useless. He had nothing left but the knowledge he carried and the certainty that no one was coming for him. The incendiary gel was thick, clinging to the ferrocrete floor and climbing the smooth steel walls like a hungry, molten vine. It moved silently, its only sound the faint, wet hiss of its chemical reaction, a sound that ate the last remnants of clean air. Nolan scrambled backward on hands and knees, dragging his useless right arm. The arm was now a landscape of searing pain, the blistered skin catching against the rough metal floor. The smell was cloying, burnt plastic mixed with something sharply industrial, designed to eradicate, not merely extinguish. He reached the base of the automated stacker unit, pressing his back against the cold, dead metal. The impact from the explosion had jarred something loose in his left shoulder, sending dull, rhythmic aches pulsing down his functional arm. He was trapped in a chamber rapidly being consumed by fire gel, his escape route a shattered hole leading to vacuum, and 15 decks above him, the matriarch, Brythar, was stirring. The drive in his tunic pocket was cold, a small inert tomb for the truth. He had saved billions, but at the cost of his body, his dignity, and his immediate survival. The Mandate team wasn't trying to capture him. They were executing a scorched earth protocol: eliminate the threat, Nolan, eliminate the evidence, the Bay, and contain the matriarch's inevitable breakout to the upper decks. They had accepted the station as lost, writing off the thousands of lives on board as collateral damage. Nolan watched the viscous gel climb the column beside him. It was moving too fast. He had minutes, perhaps less than 1 minute, before the chemical heat reached a catastrophic level. The metal around him began to warp and groan under the concentrated temperature. He closed his eyes, inhaling the last fragments of breathable air. The fatigue was a lead blanket, heavy and suffocating. It was not the exhaustion of a long shift, but the deep, bone-weary defeat of knowing his life had been nothing more than a series of principled failures. He had obeyed the rules on Acheron 7th and been ruined. He had broken the rules for Brythar and been utterly destroyed. It was always going to end like this, he thought, the truth settling on him with crushing weight. He wasn't a hero. He was a stubborn mechanic who refused to die quietly. And that refusal had only accelerated his demise and dragged a cosmic being into the light of his small, petty rebellion. He had acted on impulse, a need to stop the sonic buzzing, a need to fight the injustice of silent, systematic torture. But beneath the noble impulse, he admitted the raw truth to the silent, smoke-filled air. He had wanted to matter. He wanted the Mandate to acknowledge that the system was broken. His final catastrophic act was not one of saving the galaxy, but of forcing an arrogant entity to recognize his existence, even as it burned him alive. Vanity disguised as martyrdom. The failure tasted like copper and bile. Elsha Pike, the only person who might have understood the matriarch's message, was gone. The coordinates she sent were a cruel joke, a lure to draw him out for the Carthage fleet. He was entirely alone. He shifted, trying to put more distance between himself and the rapidly spreading gel. The heat was becoming unbearable, baking the air out of his lungs. His vision blurred, not from the smoke, but from the sudden, sharp rush of despair. He had nothing left. No tools, no allies, no path forward. Then, his good hand brushed against a floor grating, a maintenance access panel, heavily bolted down. The metal was already hot, but the area directly beneath it might still hold clean, cold air, insulated by the thick, 4-inch-thick substructure. He tried to lift the grating, pulling with his left arm, but the steel was heavy, and the bolts were seized by the sudden contraction of the metal. He didn't have the leverage, and the pain in his shoulder made any sustained effort impossible. He pulled back, his head spinning. He needed a tool or explosive force. He had neither. He was watching the walls melt and the fire gel crawl closer, waiting for the final chemical embrace. Wait. He remembered the schematics. The substructure beneath the bay floor contained the fuel regulators he had overloaded, the point of his initial, controlled detonation. He had inserted the crystalline stabilizer chip into the console to prevent a major explosion. He had been burned saving the component. The chip. It was still in the main console, glowing white-hot, but stable. The console was 3 meters away, rapidly being engulfed by the fire gel. The component was small, crystalline, and designed for high thermal resistance. It was the only thing in the room that was not currently melting or useless. It was a tool of focus, capable of channeling massive energy. Nolan looked at the raging gel. He looked at the console, now surrounded by a shimmering pool of fire gel, its surface beginning to bubble. The crystalline chip was visible, a tiny point of intense light against the warping metal. The jump drive engine. The geometric code he had broadcast, the matriarch's secret, had mapped the energy flows. It wasn't just a map, it was an instruction set. If the engine was fried, perhaps the core was still intact, merely powered down. He had cut the power. He hadn't destroyed the engine itself. The mandate's security protocols were based on redundancy. Even in total power failure, the engine, designed to withstand massive localized disruption, would maintain a minimal, latent charge for immediate diagnostic access. A ghost voltage, waiting for a mechanic to check the fuses. If Nolan could retrieve that stabilizing chip, and if he could channel that ghost voltage, a power source he knew existed, but which the Mandate had forgotten in their panic, he might have enough focused energy for one final, desperate act. One concentrated burst to shear the seized bolts on the floor grating. It was insane. The walk to the console would mean swimming through the fire gel and potentially vaporizing his left hand, leaving him completely helpless. But the alternative was certain incineration. He didn't think about courage or defiance. He thought only about the technical problem. Retrieve the chip, survive the fire gel, access the ghost voltage. He pulled the empty, dead data drive from his collar port, forcing his mind into the clinical detachment of his old engineering days. The drive was small, smooth. If he could wrap the drive in his synthetic boot cloth, he might create a temporary, if minimal, insulator. He reached down, gripping the edge of his synthetic boot sole, and ripped the material free with a searing pull. He wrapped the cloth around the dead data drive, then wrapped the assembly around his good hand, creating a small, crude scoop. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the chemical burn. He had to move now. The floor around the console began to glow orange. Nolan launched himself forward, crawling rapidly, not toward the console, but slightly to the left, aiming for the area where the gel was thinnest. The synthetic armor plating on his trousers immediately began to sizzle and smoke as he dragged his legs through the sticky substance. The heat was immense, radiating through the thin fabric, searing the back of his thighs. He reached the console, his left hand trembling with effort and heat exhaustion. The console was melting, the plastic casing bubbling and smoking. The crystalline chip was there, shimmering in the center of the thermal runoff. Nolan gritted his teeth, shoving his cloth-wrapped hand into the molten gel, past the point of pain. The heat surged through the makeshift insulation, burning the tips of his fingers. He felt the sharp, immediate agony as the synthetic fabric vaporized. He clamped his thumb and forefinger around the chip, pulling it free with a final desperate jerk. He collapsed backward, rolling away from the main pool of gel. He pressed the chip against his forehead, feeling its intense, concentrated heat sink into his skin, momentarily overwhelming the pain in his arm. He had the tool. Now, the gamble. Nolan crawled back to the maintenance grating. He found the access point for the jump drive diagnostic line, a small, recessed socket near the edge of the grating. He forced the crystalline chip into the socket. The chip immediately glowed a faint, angry red, indicating it was drawing residual energy. He could feel the minute vibration of the latent charge through the floor plate, the ghost voltage. He had to channel it all instantly into the seized bolts. But the chip was small, and the force needed to shear the bolts was massive. The chip would likely burn out after the first try, leaving him back at zero. He had one chance. Nolan positioned his left hand directly over the first set of bolts, bracing himself. He focused solely on the internal structural map Brythar had given him, remembering the geometric flow of energy. He didn't need to understand the alien language. He needed to understand its physics. He triggered the shunt. Crack. A fierce white energy burst from the chip, traveling directly into the ferrocrete. The force of the discharge slammed his hand against the grating, sending a fresh wave of blinding pain through his injured shoulder. Smoke erupted from the bolts they were still holding. The chip flickered, its light dying. Nolan felt a sickening lurch in his gut. He had failed. He had risked everything, endured agonizing pain, and the physics of the seized metal had defeated him. He was about to withdraw his hand, accepting the inevitable, when the light on the chip, now barely visible, flashed green. Not red, not white, but a deep, vibrant green, the color of life support. The matriarch's geometric energy, residual in the data drive he had just held, had injected a final, self-repairing pulse into the crystalline material, giving it a fleeting, second surge. Not a tool of physics, Nolan realized, stunned, but a tool of biology. He immediately plunged the last remaining energy into the second set of bolts, ignoring the searing pain in his hand. Carumble. The sound was immense. The residual charge, boosted by the matriarch's biological code, tore the remaining bolts clean through. The heavy metal grating shuddered violently, then tilted inward, exposing the black, cold space of the service duct beneath. A plume of freezing, clean air rushed up, hitting Nolan's face like a physical blow. He didn't wait. He shoved himself through the opening, sacrificing the last remnants of his strength, and tumbled headfirst into the cramped, cold space of the ventilation conduit. The searing heat of the fire gel instantly vanished, replaced by the deep, structural chill of the station's underbelly. He landed hard on his back, the fall stealing the last of his breath. He lay still, gasping, tasting only the cold, dry air. Above him, the chemical fire raged, eating the evidence of his presence. But the silence was shattered. The moment the grating slammed shut above him, the dead silence of Nomara Deep ended. A generalized alarm system, the lowest priority, chemically induced emergency alert, woke up, screeching across the station's internal speakers. It wasn't the high-frequency wail of a security breach. It was the ragged, mechanical moan of a desperate system, struggling to report structural compromise. A voice, tight and familiar, cut through the alarm, directed through an unstable, localized comms channel. Taris, All remaining personnel. The lower service decks are compromised. Initiate Level 1 lockdown, Deck 12 and below. The asset is moving. Repeat, the Gahara Matriarch is mobile. Focus on containment perimeter Row 7. Price is confirmed neutralized in Bay 1. Nolan pushed himself up, leaning against the cold, cylindrical wall of the duct. He was alive, trapped, and considered dead. But Taris had lied. The Matriarch wasn't moving toward an unknown perimeter. Nolan accessed the trace elements of the geometric map still imprinted on his internal visor display. Britha was not moving away from containment. She was moving with purpose. Her immense form was descending, deck by deck, moving directly through the deepest, coldest service conduits. She was heading, not toward escape, but toward the one place where she was most vulnerable, and where the Mandate would least expect her. She was descending toward the decommissioned Cargo Bay 47, the same dark, isolated bay where Nolan had first decrypted her message hours ago. She was returning to the scene of the crime, demanding a confrontation. And in her path, the geometric map showed only one structure standing, the main atmospheric regulation unit of the entire station. A single weak point. Nolan looked down the long, dark, frozen cylinder of the conduit, the alarm screeching around him, feeling the profound exhaustion of his burnt body. He knew he had to move. He had survived the fire, but he was crawling directly into the path of a cosmic horror. He didn't know why Britha was heading there, but the thought of the two of them, the fugitive mechanic and the enraged queen, meeting again in the cold, oily darkness of Bay 47, felt like a debt that was about to be paid in full. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country, or planet, are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The crawl was an agony of technical endurance, not physical strength. The floor of the ventilation conduit was slick with condensation and oil, freezing cold, sucking the remaining heat from Nolan's body. Every shift of his weight sent a grinding wave of pain through his shoulder and the burnt landscape of his right arm. The high, jagged screech of the chemical alarm was relentless, but worse was the underlying, low thrum of the station's environmental systems shifting into lethal modes. Nolan pushed himself forward, his visor display flickering faintly with the geometric trace of Brythar's movement. She was descending, steady and purposeful, toward the enormous cylindrical mass of the main atmospheric regulator unit situated beneath Bay 47. He understood her intention instantly, not escape, but coercion. If she compromised the regulator, she could initiate a massive, localized atmospheric purge, forcing the Mandate to breach their own protocols and expose themselves for a desperate, immediate repair attempt. It was a siege weapon, using the very air necessary for human life as leverage. The system detected his unauthorized movement in Section 11. Taris's voice, filtered through an unstable emergency speaker network, was tight with cold fury, no longer the detached arrogance of an overseer. Deck 9. We have intrusion in the service level. Seal all secondary conduits. Initiate nitrogen purge in sections 7 through 12. Isolate the main intake. Nitrogen. Standard Mandate containment protocol for biological contamination. A swift, cold, airless death. Nolan was trapped in the center of the kill zone. He reached a maintenance junction box, an obsolete model crusted in decades of dried hydraulic grease. He slammed the crystalline chip into the auxiliary service port, ignoring the searing pain from his burnt fingertips. The chip, still faintly alive with the Matriarch's residual biological energy, flared vibrant green. He didn't attempt complex coding. He needed violence. He located the environmental shunt diagram in his memory banks, a deep, forgotten override protocol for legacy systems. The shunt, if overloaded, would cut the nitrogen flow, but it also controlled the main water lines used for thermal dampening. Nolan had mere seconds before the nitrogen front hit. He forced the green pulse of energy into the shunt. The system howled, a sudden, distressed metallic shriek, immediately followed by the sound of tearing metal. Instead of the cold, dry silence of nitrogen, a massive pressurized burst erupted from a ruptured pipe 3 feet ahead. Thick, scalding water mixed with high-pressure steam and hydraulic fluid hammered the walls, spraying back in a blinding corrosive mist. The heat was agonizing, scalding the raw skin of his right arm, but it was survivable. It was wet, breathable chaos. The steam, flooding the conduit, halted the dry, sterile advance of the nitrogen purge. Nolan clawed his way through the pressurized sauna, coughing against the oily heat, buying himself perhaps 60 seconds of movement before the system compensated. The cost was immediate and total. The crystalline chip, having expended the last of its complex, biologically charged energy in the massive power shunt, shattered in the port. Nolan heard the dry, high-pitched tink as the fragments fell into the ductwork below. His last technological link to Brythar, his physical evidence, was gone. He burst out of the conduit exit and into the vast, freezing emptiness of Bay 47. The air here was sharp, intensely cold, smelling of clean oxygen and spent propellant. The sudden transition from scalding heat to deep structural chill made his teeth ache violently. The bay was dark, illuminated only by emergency red and white strobes that cast epileptic, disorienting shadows. The enormous cylinder of the atmospheric regulator unit dominated the scene, humming with the steady, dull power of concentrated infrastructure. Brythar was there. She had descended by sheer structural failure, tearing through several decks, her massive body now partially coiled around the regulator's base. She was immense, yet strangely focused, her obsidian armor radiating a faint internal heat that shimmered in the cold air. She was wounded, too. Nolan saw fissures in her carapace, slow leaks of clear, viscous fluid pooling onto the ferrocrete floor. Her descent had cost her dearly. Her head was lowered, her complex eyes reflecting the frantic red lights. Her attention was solely on the regulator's primary access nexus, the critical weak point, exactly where he expected. Nolan hobbled forward, prioritizing movement over pain. He reached the nexus access panel. It was secured by 6 heavy-duty latches, locked down against any system-wide breach. He did not have time for codes. He had to rely on brute force and focused energy. The static on the emergency speakers intensified, Terrace's voice distorted and desperate. "Price! Cease movement! We are sending remote suppression units. Do not touch the nexus." Nolan ignored him. He pulled the mandate-issued magnetic field disruptor he had salvaged earlier, a heavy, simple tool for fusing jump drive relays. He slammed the disruptor against the first latch, the metal thunk lost in the chaotic noise. The latch melted open, the steel bubbling like thick molasses. The mandate's final defense arrived. 4 dark, sleek anti-personnel drones, dropping from the high shadows near the ceiling, their targeting lasers, silent and deadly, locked onto the human figure below. Taris was prioritizing the mechanic over the matriarch, convinced Nolan was the strategic trigger. Nolan slammed the disruptor into the second latch. Thunk. The first drone fired. A sharp, sizzling energy bolt missed Nolan by inches, searing a line across the steel structure above Brythar's head. Brythar moved. Not quickly, but with immense, deliberate precision. She raised a colossal obsidian claw, extending a sensitive metallic mesh, a massive sensory organ, directly into the path of the drone's targeting frequency. It was a biological counter-encryption. The 4 drones went instantly wild, their aiming systems scrambling under the flood of alien code. They began firing erratic energy bursts at the ceiling and walls, sparking violently as their electrical systems shorted out. Brythar lowered her claw. She had bought him perhaps 4 seconds of clear space. She had used her own energy, her own vulnerable sensory array, to protect him from a human weapon. Nolan hammered the remaining 4 latches in quick, agonizing succession, the disruptor hot and vibrating in his hand. The access panel sprang open, revealing the intricate, color-coded chaos of the regulator's wiring harness. He was there. The heart of the station lay exposed. Brytha was still, her immense shadow shielding him from the sparking debris of the collapsing drones. She did not prompt him, did not demand. Her mere presence was a testament to their terrible, necessary partnership. Nolan knew he couldn't stop the overall air purge response Taris had initiated, but he could exploit the ensuing system chaos. He gripped the 2 thickest primary cables, the life support regulator and the secondary power grid. He needed a complete localized short circuit, an electromagnetic pulse that would blind the station for 30 seconds, forcing Taris and the security grid into a manual reboot. He stripped the thick insulation with the ruined, melted edges of his synthetic glove, the rough copper wires biting into his skin. The jolt of residual power was palpable, a sickening, painful surge of energy. He connected the primary and secondary regulators. The resulting flash was intense, pure, and utterly silent. Every light in Bay 47 died. The fractured voice of Taris cut off mid-sentence. The chaotic mechanical screaming of the alarms vanished. Nomara Deep Station went dead, silent, and blind. Nolan collapsed against the open Nexus panel, his body shaking violently from the combined pain, exhaustion, and electrical shock. The silence was absolute, a profound pressure that felt heavier than the weight of the galaxy. Seconds later, backup thermal lights kicked on, not the powerful white light of the Mandate, but the dull, safety-regulated red glow of tertiary units. The light was just enough to show the metallic carnage of the bay. The EMP had worked. The system was neutralized. Nolan looked at the atmospheric regulator. The control panel was fried, the primary flow compromised. The station was crippled, but not destroyed. The human crew would survive, but the Mandate was deaf and dumb, flailing in the dark. He looked at Brythar. She was unmoving, her massive body radiating a low, visible heat against the cold steel, like a banked furnace. She had given everything to create this chaos, this opportunity. She was exhausted, profoundly so. Nolan found the strength to push himself away from the Nexus. The immediate threat was gone. He had won the war of systems, but lost the tools, the evidence, and the physical capacity to continue. Then he saw the hole. The massive, ragged tear Brytha had punched into the bay floor when she descended was not random damage. It led directly into the decommissioned hangar holding the station's only functional emergency escape pod. Brytha hadn't been targeting the regulator to escape herself. She had targeted it to create the diversion and the system blindness necessary for him, the insignificant, burnt mechanic, to take the pod and run. He dragged himself toward the jagged opening, the immense, motionless shadow of the matriarch looming over him. Nolan paused at the edge of the chasm, the cold draft of the hangar rushing up to meet him. He looked back one last time at the cosmic terror who had become his unwilling accomplice. Brytha raised her head a fraction, her eyes vast black pools in the red light. She conveyed no command, no plea, only the immense, solemn expectation of a partner fulfilling a final obligation. She was the anchor, he was the messenger. He lowered his body through the opening and dropped onto the cold, clean metal deck of the hangar floor. He moved immediately to the escape pod, sleek and small, a technical lifeboat. He inserted his ID chip, an act of pure, technical formality that the now blind Mandate could not register, and the engine gave a comforting low hum of readiness. Before sealing the hatch, Nolan looked up into the blackness of Bay 47. The matriarch was obscured by the shadows and the heat distortion, but her presence was immense, heavy, and profound. He sealed the hatch, the internal pressure stabilizing instantly. He was safe. escaping his prison of debt and misery, but entering the isolation of deep space, alone with the gravest secret in the sector. He checked the drive status. Operational. Through the small viewport, the massive, shattered bulk of Nomara Deep Station began to recede, already listing slightly in the vacuum, crippled by the technical chaos he had wrought. He had survived the fire, survived the system, and survived the alien. The jump drive stabilized, the internal light turning a steady, soothing blue. Nolan reached into his pocket and touched the small, smooth data drive, the dead storage that held Brytha's secret, a burden of truth and obligation. He initiated the sequence. The galaxy was vast, and he was finally free. The quiet of the escape pod was a physical shock. It wasn't the sudden silence of a failed jump drive, which had a frantic electric smell. This was the silence of deep water, cushioned by inert gases and 3 layers of ablative armor. The relentless, high-pitched mechanical screaming of Nomara Deep Station was gone, replaced by the faint rhythmic hiss of the pod's own closed-loop atmosphere recycling. Nolan Price sat in the narrow, cold pilot seat, the vinyl sticky beneath his sweat-soaked tunic. The adrenaline that had carried him through scalding steam and electrocution now drained away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling fatigue. He felt the full weight of his injuries. The right arm throbbed with a dull, persistent fire where the copper had bitten him. His left shoulder felt dislocated, useless. He was 4,000 kilometers out, accelerating on sublight boosters. The viewport showed the vast, uncompromising blackness of the void, speckled with distant, indifferent stars. Behind him, Nomara Deep Station was a tiny, dim smudge, a ghost in the periphery. It was crippled, not destroyed. The human crew would be busy with manual reboots and triage, trying to repair the technical hemorrhage he and Brythar had engineered. He knew Taris would be furious, not at the escape, but at the sheer, embarrassing volume of damage done by a single mechanic and a captive matriarch. Nolan reached into his tunic pocket. He pulled out the data drive. It was cool, smooth and inert, a perfect cylinder of solid-state memory. The green, living glow was gone, sacrificed in the heat of the wiring harness. It was just a black metal shell now, holding the volume of encoded truth. He ran his thumb over the surface, a gesture of weary reverence for the burden he now carried. He wasn't a hero, just a liability that Brythar had deemed necessary to preserve. He had cost the Mandate far more than his 1,200 credits, but he hadn't saved humanity. He had merely fulfilled a pact of mutual defiance against a system built on regulation and contained misery. He checked the navigation display. The projected trajectory was not toward the inner systems, which would mean immediate capture, nor toward the outer rim, which was too exposed. It was charting a slow, circuitous path into a dead zone sector, toward an orbital classification labeled only as the Fallow, a sector of abandoned colonial efforts and derelict military vessels, a place where the Mandate rarely bothered to extend its cold, algorithmic grasp. The path was too precise, too safe for a random escape. Brythar, even when deeply contained, had been calculating her exit route, planning for this exact moment of chaos. She hadn't sought freedom. She had sought delivery. Nolan lowered the internal lights to a minimum, letting the deep blue glow of the jump drive indicators wash over the cabin. He looked at his reflection in the viewport glass, haggard, scarred, a lifetime of systemic injustice now etched visibly onto his skin. The cold dread he had felt under his ribs in the beginning was gone, replaced by the heavy, necessary weight of responsibility. He was a fugitive, but he was no longer a victim of arbitrary assignment. He reached up, resting his good hand on the control console. His teeth weren't buzzing now from the constant, low-frequency hum of containment. That sound, the sonic spike that tormented the alien and grated on his nerves, was finally gone from his universe. The station, was silenced. Brythar's suffering and his initial petty act of kindness had purchased his life, but it had bought him exile. He wasn't running from something anymore. He was running to a destination encoded by a beautiful, terrible creature who had seen in him not a guard, but a necessary channel. He had the secret, and the galaxy was vast enough to hide it, for now. He punched the final jump sequence command. The pod trembled violently, gathering immense energy. The stars outside stretched into searing lines of light, then snapped back into a dizzying, multicolored vortex. He closed his eyes against the disorientation, feeling the pressure mount in his chest. The jump settled. The vortex collapsed, revealing an entirely new configuration of distant light, a fresh, unfamiliar sector. The silence was profound. He was a ghost now, carrying a truth that guaranteed his death if it were ever exposed. He knew the Mandate would file the incident under systemic failure due to unknown biological contamination. Taris would be purged from the administration, and the record of Nolan Price, the engineer who reported core meltdown, the guard who adjusted frequency, the mechanic who fried the grid, would vanish into the digital static. He was finally clear of the Mandate's long, cold accounting. He sat back in the pilot seat, adjusting his position against the residual pain, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth cylinder of the data drive in his pocket. The scar of the burn on his arm felt cold now, a permanent brand of complicity. He was free of the station's endless, grinding noise. But the silence was sharper, harder to bear, weighted now by the unspoken agreement with the Queen. He checked the chronometer. 420 hours until the estimated arrival at the Fallow. He had a long flight ahead, alone. He looked out at the infinite expanse, the destination unknown, the risk absolute. He started the slow, painful process of tending to his wounds. The cost of his survival had been everything: his home, his job, his reputation, his meager 1,200 credits. But he had gained something back that was far heavier than any injustice. He was the Mandate's last oversight, carrying the first whispers of a counter-history across the dark. The debt was paid, but the partnership was just beginning. He pulled the drive out and looked at it, perfectly smooth, perfectly silent. It wasn't just data. It was a declaration of war against the cold, unyielding system that had used and discarded them both. The galaxy was vast and indifferent, but for the first time in years, the constant, suppressive hum was finally gone. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.